Hi. Welcome to the second of Culture Counts Connection web series. My name is Jordan Gibbs. I'm the client director here at Culture Counts. We've been running a couple of bite-sized conversations about topics of interest and our evolving circumstances. So today I am joined by Michael Chappell, CEO of Culture Counts. Hey there, Mike.
Jordan.
Georgia, Managing Director of Culture Counts. Hi, Georgia.
Hi, Jordan.
John Knell, Managing Director of Counting What Counts. John, hello.
Hi, Jordan. Nice to see you.
And this week we're also joined by Lucy Hill, Senior Consultant from Pracsys Economics. Hey there, Luce.
Hello.
Okay, so look, before we jump right into this, and I'm gonna check my notes for this. It should be worth pointing out that look, all our guests today actually have backgrounds in economics. So if the saying is correct, we should hopefully get up to 4 different opinions. Look, I think it's also probably worth acknowledging that while we're talking about economic impact today, this won't be a cure is worse than a disease conversation about relaxing social distancing. But in saying that, I think it's also important to note that the immediate effects of this crisis, including job losses, are very real. So we don't want this conversation today to take away from that. And we discuss whether or not this might be a kind of too soon conversation to have. But look, recently our organisational survey showed that 68% of respondents wanted to know what the future of the sector looked like. And so I think it's fair to say that in terms of defining economic impact, that's been a real kind of component within the sector and, in the advocacy for it and also right now. So I think that means to me, I think it's probably more valuable to have this conversation than it is to not have it. So hopefully you have the capacity to think about the future of the sector. And if you do, this conversation will be really helpful. So, okay, great. That being said, I just want to jump in this with maybe a provocation here. And this is obviously from my perspective in Australia. So Germany released a €50 billion rescue package for the arts. Arts Council England announced £160 million worth of funding as a response to this crisis. According to Australian government research, the cultural sector is worth about $111 billion per annum, or about 6% of Australia's GDP. Yet, I think it's fair to say, and what I've been, reading a lot online, the Australian government's fiscal response has probably not been as strong as we've seen overseas. Though that being said, we are seeing, some emergency funding from Australia Council, states, and local governments as well. In my reading of the conversations out there, I think there is a frustration in the cultural sector that government doesn't understand or appreciate the sector's economic value. And we're seeing lots of confusion about what the economic impact of the sector is. So, is the reason, maybe, this is the provocation, is the reason that we aren't seeing the financial support for the sector because government doesn't understand the value of the sector? Mike, I'd like to hit you with that provocation first.
I think the answer, Jordan, in short, is yes, but it's not just the government that doesn't understand it. I think it's a sector-wide issue. Economic impact really exists at the grassroots level, at local events, in theatres, in galleries, in museums, but also there's an aggregate picture of the impact of the whole sector at a strategic level. So we can think about economic impact for local government, and we can think about economic impact for state and federal government. There's not really any definitive rule about how economic impact is measured, and that lack of standardisation leads to a plethora of different approaches. That coupled with a lack of understanding of the definition of the cultural sector, there's blurred edges to it. That tends to exacerbate the problem of the different approaches to measurement. Those two things combined are really problematic. At the local level, though, economic impact is really about the concept of additionality. So that's new money coming into the economy. And right now, that is a very difficult proposition because movement is severely restricted. So at the local level, additionality is the key issue.
Yeah, look, Mike, I might stop you there because I have spent what is an unfortunate amount of time in my life trying to understand economic impact models, and additionality is something that I am constantly trying to have to explain. So, look, maybe actually, Georgia, do you want to unpack a little bit of about that concept for us?
Absolutely. So I think what we're seeing at the moment is an almost total reduction in additional spend. So that is money that's being brought into the economy from outside. And when we talk about economic impact, it's really important that we distinguish between that new money, so that's being injected into the economy, and then the stimulated spend that is spent by people that live within that economy. So stimulated spend, we assume that people will spend at some time anyway. So they either save it or they spend it. And for an individual organisation, individual arts organisation, there's not really any difference between receiving money from a tourist or receiving money from a local community member. So if they both pay the same ticket price, for example, it makes no difference to them.
But I guess then the difference will be in then for economic impact, the money that those people might then spend in the wider economy, not necessarily just the show itself. Yeah.
Exactly. So, I mean, for the economy as a whole, any sector that can attract tourist spend or that could generate export income is bringing new money into the economy that will balance out that money that's flowing out when we purchase imported goods. So, yeah, traditionally when we look at the economic impact of the art sector, we think about that tourist spend. So we think about the people that travel to Melbourne every year to see a NGV blockbuster, or the people that are flocking to Tasmania to visit Mona. And that's ceased at the moment, unfortunately. So we also then need to consider the that stimulated spend, because it is still very important that we retain our local spend within our local areas or within our state or within our country, because that spend still plays a very important role in paying people's wages and flowing through to supporting sectors. And it has a very important sort of long-term flow and effect for our economy.
Yeah, and so I guess then distinguishing between like stimulated spend and an additional spend within an economy, like for a small business, I mean, revenue is revenue, right? I mean, whether or not it's new money or stimulated spend, I guess it doesn't make the difference to them. But I suppose then in the explaining the additional spend is that the idea is that that's money that local business may have not have received otherwise if it wasn't for the fact that, cultural activity and activation was going on in that space. Sorry, I've totally I totally cut you off there. But we still haven't. We're not. I guess we're not really talking about those other economic impacts that might not just be about revenue, whether or not it's talking about the value of social connection, and even in terms of that $111 billion number. I mean, that's GVA, which is essentially not even kind of including any of that. Luce, maybe you can help us out here in terms of trying to understand the value of the sector and the value of cultural activity.
Yes, so when we're talking about economic impact, it is important to understand why we're doing it and if it's a good measure for every sector. So in a traditional economy, we're just looking at jobs created and outputs created and so on for some industries that may capture majority of what is it about. But for other sectors, it is important to understand what is the overall role and purpose of it and look at the social impacts of that. If we are comparing cultural sector to the rest of the economy, probably just jobs, GVA, and output is not going to capture everything that it creates. The purpose of the cultural sector is not just that. It is also just to improve our well-being, improve our quality of life, improve mental health, and be there as a source of joy in our life. And it is important to consider these values when we are talking about the overall impact of the sector and how important it is to us. So in some countries, like in England, for example, it is mandatory to measure not only economic impact of the sectors, but also to look at the social impact. And that creates a more level field for every economic player to show their role and their importance.
Sorry, that's an amazing point, and I guess for those who will have heard it before, I mean the Green Book standards in the UK are kind of part of that. John, I would just want to kind of draw you back to, I mean, the provocation in the question, which was whether or not the reason that we aren't seeing the kind of support that I guess the sector would expect is because government doesn't understand the value of the sector.
Yeah, I think they do. I mean, there's been a veritable industry of economic, social, and cultural measurement over the last 10 years that's tried to convince them of the value. I think the challenge for government and others is it's a complex ecology that creates that value. So if we look at, you mentioned the German 50 billion euro fund. So I would suggest that let's have a provocation. The UK government understands the value; they don't understand the ecology that well. It would appear the German government understands the ecology that creates that value very well, because how they're using that 50 billion euros is they're giving small grants to individual artists and creative entrepreneurs rather than giving large grants to institutions. Why is that important? Because actually, if you think of cultural organisations as the hives, and all of this huge mass of independent artists and creative workers who often have very precarious lives, living project by project, they're vital in creating the value. They're the ones pollinating between different hives. They're the ones that are doing knowledge exchange across sectors. And I think, therefore, what's being missed in the debate about value at the moment and how to support the cultural sector is actually it's an incredibly dynamic sector, but a lot of the people that create the dynamism are it's been called the precarious workforce. And actually they're also falling through the gaps a lot of the current government support measures because they're supporting organisations and people in permanent employment. They're not supporting freelancers. So in that sense, I think that you need to understand that whole ecology of value creation, and that's where we should be That's where we should be arguing. In other words, it's easier to save an institution than it is to support the whole ecology. So there are attempts to save institutions because that's how you can channel your job save or furloughing here in the UK. It's a much more complicated question to say, how do we best sustain that ecology through COVID?
Yeah, sorry, John, that is an amazing point. And actually, you've done my job for me, because the real kind of second provocation and conversation that I wanted to have was particularly around the nature of employment in the cultural sector. And so if I could just kind of share some stats with you as they are at the moment from the Australian Bureau of Statistics. So, I mean, in a lot of the media, we're seeing, any industry that very much relied on, social gathering and that, demand there that hasn't been able to, pivot. We're seeing massive drawback. So hospitality in particular in Australia has reduced about 33% of its workforce over the last month, and arts and recreation, as it's determined by the ABS, is down 27% in terms of its workforce, and that's compared to an Australian rate of about 7.5% down in the last month. So yeah, hospitality and the cultural sector have been both really hit by this. But I think the other thing that's really revealing here is that in terms of the Australian government's response and JobKeeper, of about the 40% of arts and rec orgs that didn't apply for it, just over half of them said that they couldn't apply for it because it didn't fit any of their staff. They didn't meet the requirements. And in saying that, I mean, just the other thing here is that, I mean, a UK survey just found that, musicians are another classically freelance element of the sector. Potentially 1 in 5 musicians might not return to the sector post-COVID. So yeah, bringing back to your point there, like the government are putting out economic lifeboats through stimulus, business support, other means. This kind of data, and anyone who's in the sector, and I assume anyone who's watching this already knows that the cultural sector is struggling. So, I mean, here's the argument, right? I mean, here's the question. What does the cultural sector deliver that makes supporting it a priority for government rather than just putting it in the queue with the rest of, with every other sector out there? Mike, how do you feel about having a go at that one?
I think that's the key question for today's discussion is what role will the creative sector play in the recovery? The cumulative investment in arts and cultural activity from private sources, philanthropic sources, and government gives us a capacity for creativity. That connection between the funded part of the arts and cultural sector and the mainstream creative industries is really fed by that investment. The social networks that exist within our communities and within our economy, which connects that creative capacity to mainstream industries, and then the resulting indicators of STEAM education, STEAM qualification, science, technology, engineering, arts, and maths. Those are really the bedrock industries that enable us to pivot in times of strain and challenge, as we have now. And we always thought of the challenges to be environmental or economic, but in this case, it's a health challenge which is permeating right throughout our community. And we're going to really rely on the creative sector to help us to innovate and show new ways of conducting ourselves in the future. John's point about the German fund distribution model being to individual artists rather than to individual or to aggregate organisations is a really good one. They understand where the creativity comes from, and that's why I believe that they've taken that approach. I don't think that is how we work in Australia, and unfortunately I think that is going to be a major impediment to the recovery effort. We need to support individual artists and creative workers within the economy first.
Lucy, I guess this goes back to the points you were making earlier about the other, like the intangibles. In to use an economic term. What do you want to add to this?
I would like to continue on from what Mike was saying. It is really important to see at this cultural sector not in isolation, but in connection to everything else in the economy. And it's not only talking about creating and improving capacity in that sector and in the overall creative industries, but we need to look at how culture improves our life and mental health, and how it teaches us and provides us an opportunity to come together. So we already see how important it is now at these times when we are struggling for going through these COVID-19 times, and how we turn to culture and social connection to bring us together and help us cope with that. So it is an important part of this sector, which has a flow-on impact throughout the economy. So because it has impact on mental health, for example, it's not only creating jobs and output in the direct cultural industry sector, so for example in theaters and so on, but it has a connection to the overall health system as well. So it will reduce the expenditure on mental health if we have culture there to help us cope with the times like that. So this is a very important role for culture, and government and all of us need to recognize that. So when we come out on the other side of this, we still have this culture available to us.
John, I can see I can hear these arguments, and I can see how they make sense for anyone who's in the sector. But I guess what I'm imagining now is, some kind of bureaucrat who gets it having to talk to someone who really doesn't understand it. I mean, here's the question that I can see them asking: like, why should we put the cultural sector to the front of the queue? Everyone is suffering.
I think, to build on what other colleagues have said, I think, and other sectors will be making similar powerful cases for their contribution. I think the argument that the cultural sector is uniquely value creating, that it creates value across a whole different range of values, so cultural, social, economic, civic, public value, is I think one argument that's very important. The cultural sector doesn't make widgets in Walsall. No disrespect to a widget maker in Walsall, but they're broader social, civic and public value seems rather lower than me to supporting the workforce and supply chain that sustains some creative and cultural industries. So that's point number one. I think the other thing is, building on what Mike said, is that I think that the sector and key parts of it and its workforce are incredibly dynamic. They are inherently entrepreneurial, and they're very good at sustaining themselves. So I think that in terms of maintaining, if you want to use an economic argument, maintaining economic capacity in the economy that actually is quite resilient, quite adaptive, and very prone to innovation, and very good at boundary crossing and interdisciplinary innovation, creating value, whether in social services, in the health sector, in R&D, in digital, in tech. That's the cultural sector. It's a boundary spanning sector. It's naturally interdisciplinary, and at its best, it's brilliant at innovating. And the other most important thing is we also need sectors that are going to kickstart the wider economy. So obviously there and globally, there's this debate about what are people's attitudes going to be as we start to progressively lift social distancing. How quickly are people return to normal? Well, the economy is going to need one starter motor in an engine isn't going to restart the global economy. We need 4 or 5. Culture's one of those. In terms of programming and activity that takes place at a local level, online or elsewhere, the sector has a genius for telling stories and creating moments that bring us together. And they will also encourage us to congregate again in new ways. They will encourage us to start thinking differently about the future. That is always the genius of the cultural sector. It allows us to understand ourselves and what's coming differently. And for all of those reasons, and many more if I had longer, but I don't think you want me to keep talking, I think the sector is uniquely value creating. And I think that argument can be made powerfully and loudly, and should be.
Boom. That's a great argument. Look, final question, right? In all of this, and I'm thinking again about social distancing, right? So if business models of the sector, are changing, because social distancing is very much a real thing. I mean, what changes are we going to see in the economic impact of the sector? So, okay, so let me just say this. So if traditional economic impact was about bringing new money into local economies or stimulating spend and activating an area, and if those things can't happen because of social distancing, what is the economic impact argument for the sector at those local levels? Georgia, do you want to have a go at that?
Sure. Yeah, I think our traditional ways of operating and our traditional ways of measuring economic impact will have to change. I mean, we've seen that the state, the national, the regional borders are all shut. People have been asked to, not leave their homes. And so there's no way for that physical money to actually come into our economies. And so, of course, it can come in digitally, but a lot of our traditional arts activities have been based around live experiences and physical interactions with the artwork and with people. So there does need to be some innovation and adaptation, which as we've talked about, the sector is really primed to do. And we're going to explore that a bit further in coming weeks with some of the case studies that we've been witnessing.
Yep.
But we have seen in other sectors such as restaurants, hospitality, retail, that there's been a lot of focus on support local campaigns. So people are really appealing to their local communities to spend money with them and keep them going through this difficult period. But I don't think we've seen a lot of this from our local arts organisations. And it's an interesting one, and it maybe does come back to that idea of not really valuing themselves or their role that they play in the community. And we've seen from our recent COVID-19 cultural impact survey that 61% of organisations that are planning or are currently delivering online content have said that they won't charge fees for that content. And I think 12% said that they'll ask for donations, but that's all. So it's an interesting one, because throughout our history with Culture Counts, we've seen that local impact as a metric is always a very high scoring one for arts organisations, and that means that people who experience arts think that it's important for their local area. So I would really love to see some of our local arts organisations start to tap into that local impact and to ask for their communities to support them through this time.
really interesting, Mike. Actually, that is something that I've seen a bit about, particularly around the conversation around fees and whether or not this means that the culture, the fact that so many cultural organisations are planning on providing their services for free during this time, if that kind of represents an undervaluation of the work that they do. I wonder what you think about that in terms of that economic impact argument at the local level.
It could represent an underappreciation by artists of their work, of the value of their work, but it's probably more a lack of understanding of different business models and ways to monetize content. Local activation, which is the topic that we're discussing here, is really about the frequency and concentration of transactions. That's the economic definition of activation, the frequency and concentration of transactions. The concentration part has been ripped asunder because we can't collect in groups and we can't concentrate activity geographically. So there needs to be another concept put in there that lends itself to monetization. One thing that I've noticed walking around every day is that people are getting outside and using the parks and using the open spaces. So maybe there is a case for organisations to narrowcast content through mobile devices. There's a lot more work needing to be done, and that's the call out to the creative sector, is not just to create the content, but look at the channels through which that content can be distributed, but not only distributed, how it can be monetized. And people are a lot more aware these days of other means, be it Kickstarter or Patreon or other online giving platforms. So I think there's another version, another adaptation of those models that needs to be about live performance or live exhibition, where people can be approximately in the same area but not aggregating with the same concentrations.
Look, I think the business models conversation. Look, I've got a lot of opinions. I think the business models conversation, I think we have to do in almost a different video, because there's a lot we could talk about there. Lucy, I wanted to know if you wanted to expand on that economic impact argument at a local level. I mean, I'm particularly thinking about local councils who I guess we've seen a lot in terms of the taking those kind of small arts grants for individual artists.
That's a good point. And I guess being a little bit of optimist, I would like probably to highlight that although the economic activity has dropped everywhere, Australia is likely to emerge from this crisis sooner and better than the rest of the developed world, and particularly Western Australia. So that creates an opportunity, continuing on George's point, to tap into the local market, especially while we are still going to be isolated from the rest of the world and people are getting hungry for content. And I'm sure that when the restrictions will start lifting a little bit, everyone will want to go and start participating in more or less normal activity as they had before. So this creates an opportunity for local artists to create content and attract a local Western Australian or Australian audiences to join in. I guess that we will see the change in this economic sector and how it all works. But overall, it's about how we can work with that and how we can react to it.
John, I'll give you the last word on this. What are your thoughts about what the economic impact argument looks like for the sector at a local level? And look, I'm sure you've got thoughts on everything that everyone's talked about so far.
Well, I mean, I think it's early to be speaking into that question. I mean, you started by saying at the beginning that there's a number of economists on this call. And of course, as economists, the economic outcomes or the economic impact outcomes from the sector partly depend on how dynamically they can be supported and how they respond to the current situation. Mike talked about some of that R&D and innovation that might come forward, for example, around making work for different channels and modes of delivery, and then what that might mean for monetization. So we may well look back in 3 years' time on this period, and we see this was the moment when the cultural sector did 5 years R&D around understanding digital and its monetization models in 12 months, and that was a major kickstarter for all kinds of economic value creation for the sector. That's for the future, I suppose. So I think that it is early to say, and of course, in the end, it depends on how dynamically the sector finds itself able to respond. What I would just add, though, I think is perhaps then that links to that is just there is something really interesting going on at the moment around, is this also a dynamic and experiment in possibly reaching audiences in different ways, or people's cultural consumption patterns changing, and how might that lead to a different type of cultural sector, and could that have really long-term benefits? So it was interesting to hear Maria Borshaw run a session for the HRC, contributed to a session that the HRC run online, which is a research council here in the UK yesterday, and she runs the Tate. And she was noting a number of things, not just one, that they can absolutely certain through their digital work, and their social media followings has gone up from 10 million to 15 million, and they're putting content out online, that actually they think they're reaching new people through that, and people have got more time to consume culture digitally. But the other thing that I thought was really important that she said is that actually this is also never about a passive activity. So in terms of a lot of the resources they've been putting out around arts and kids, they've had a huge amount of artwork being uploaded. And therefore, I think that's the other thing to talk about. When we talk about the cultural sector's role, and in terms of then what could it be its economic impact, its job in fostering other people's creativity, in encouraging people to think that creativity is something for them, and how that might start to change their relationship to local cultural organisations, to local creative activity, and how that in turn will shape consumption. I think that I just offer those. So rather than say it's going to be X, I think there's some green shoots that we can see in behavioural patterns, which if the sector responds dynamically and is really prepared, like every other sector saying, that we can't go back to how things were before. We're going to have to rethink, rewire, reconstitute what this sector looks like, how it works with other partners, how we work with each other, and what we think our roles and purposes are, whilst continuing to do many of the things they did before. Things will be very different. If we say, we all know that the next 2 to 3 years is going to be a desperately difficult time for all sectors. But the interesting question becomes how we respond now may create the foundations for a more confident and a more vibrant and a more open and a more plural sector in 5-6 years' time, and hopefully more economically viable than it is now. That's the challenge for all of us. We've got reasons to be optimistic that we can do that, I think.
Excellent. Look, I think we'll cap it there. Plenty to think about. Look, that'll be it for the second of our web series. But I want to thank you, and I want to thank also our guests, John, Mike, Georgia, Lucy. Such a pleasure to have you here. Next week, we're going to be talking about going online. Is it as simple as it sounds, or do we need to reinvent the way the cultural sector engages digitally? We're going to be looking at a couple of case studies and some researchers out there to get a sense of what this will mean for the sector during and post-COVID. But until then, look, if you want to find out any more about Culture Counts or see some of the resources that we have available, please do visit our website at our Arts Matters webpage. We've got a whole bunch of stuff on there. If you would like to get in contact or have any questions you would like answers to, please do give us a email at hello@culturecounts.cc. But look, until then, we'll see you next time.